Well, today I'm pleased again to have Dr. Lee Farrell with me from the University of Auburn in, where are you, Montgomery?
Montgomery.
And
Yeah.
down in Montgomery. She is the chair of the department there and an expert in Russian history with particular focus on U.S. relations and things. And she wrote a book some years ago. She's got several others since then, but she's written this one about Alexis in America, which is about the Grand Duke, the fourth son of Tsar Alexander II, and his trip to the United States and the adventures he had in the American Old West, or in that case, it would have been the New West, but we call it the Old West, and meeting up with some interesting characters from American history. So we kind of want to begin to zoom in and focus on that first of all. So Lee, thank you again for taking the time on Christmas Eve to be with us and talk about this.
Absolutely. I love talking about Alexis.
Yeah. Well, he's a fascinating character. Just to recap for everybody, if they didn't see the previous interview, he was, when he came to the United States, he was 21 years old. He was the fourth son of the Tsar of all the Russias, Alexander II. He was sent here on sort of a quasi-diplomatic mission and also to sort of escape a family scandal back home that we talked about in the previous one. And so he comes to the United States, arrives in New York City. They have a really sort of quick kind of welcoming celebration. Then they hustle him on a train and they send him down to Washington, D.C. for a abbreviated meeting with President Grant, which all has to do with a diplomatic flap that was going on at the time. And we sort of discussed that in some detail in the previous interview. So now, once he's finished with that trip, he goes back to New York, and now he begins sort of his journey to the West. And that's kind of what we want to focus on today. So let's maybe start off, first of all, by talking a little bit about, do you recall or remember where he may have been on Christmas Eve in 1871?
I think if I remember correctly, he was in Buffalo, New York.
Okay. So he had he'd made it to Buffalo, which was after he made a stop in Connecticut, I think. I'm getting to the Smith and Wesson gun factory.
He had gone there. But he also visited Boston and Philadelphia. So so he hit all of the sort of major eastern cities after New York and DC.
Right. So one of those stops between New York and Buffalo was at the, I think it was Smith and Wesson, if memory serves, firearms plant, where he was presented with one or two, I don't recall, Smith and Wesson pearl handled or whatever they might have been, revolvers, which become important later on the hunt, as we'll see, because then it brings Bill Cody and Lucretia into the mix.
Well, maybe, yeah.
And we'll talk about Lucretia a little bit later.
Yeah.
So he's in Philadelphia. How is the trip going at this point then?
So the trip is going very well. As you mentioned, the reception in DC was a little odd because of this diplomatic scandal, and it was atypical of his reception in other American cities. So in all of the cities he visited, there were parades and balls and banquets and special theater performances and special performances by local school children or others. And so he was very well received in all of the cities. People came out in droves to try and get a look at him. Yeah. The well-to-do in each city, and that included people like Samuel Morse and Henry Longfellow, literary and scientific people who were well known, participated in these events as well. So the trip was going quite well at this point.
So then from Buffalo, he then began where he moves, I think, on to like Cleveland and other cities.
So he does go to Canada.
Oh, okay.
for 3 stops. And he visits Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto.
Okay.
And he sees both sides of Niagara Falls. So that's, not surprising given where he was, that was an important stop. And then from there, he goes to Detroit, he goes to Cleveland, and then eventually he ends up and he goes to Milwaukee. And then he ends up in Chicago.
In Chicago, right. So in Chicago, then Chicago is the headquarters for General Phil Sheridan's what do they call that district? I think it's called District of the Missouri or something like that.
Mhm.
Basically, he's the Army general because these are still, from the Missouri River west is still pretty wild territory.
Right.
So there's Army posts out there, and so he meets up. I'm assuming he meets up. I don't recall reading that, but I'm assuming he meets up with Sheridan there in Chicago. All this is sort of preparatory to doing this buffalo hunt that he expressed an interest in. So how did that all come about?
So, it's not 100% clear whether Alexis had ever indicated before he came to the United States that he wanted to go on a buffalo hunt, but it's definitely clear that before he arrived in the United States, there was talk about trying to arrange a buffalo hunt for him. And when he did arrive, he was approached with the idea. And initially there was a discussion about whether or not he had time, but he decided to accept the invitation. And then from that point forward, there were more, the hunt was organized. And one of the people, by the way, who was involved in this was Albert Bierstadt, who was he's known as the painter of the West. So he was a very famous artist at the time, who painted scenes of the West. So he was also involved in these plans to organize a buffalo hunt for Grand Duke Alexis. And Alexis had expressed interest in seeing Native Americans. And so that, as we'll get to, that became part of the buffalo hunt experience as well.
So Bierstadt, if my memory serves, it's been a while since I've been down to the Joslin, but I think we actually have some of his original work here in Omaha on exhibit.
Okay.
So yeah. So this involves now they have to bring in the U.S. military and so on like that. So Sheridan as I said, is the general in charge of I think they call it the Department of the Missouri or something like that. And so he has to then bring all the various resources together to make this happen. This is 1871. There is actually still here in Omaha an army depot right along where the Union Pacific Railroad tracks are that is still in existence. I think it may antedate 1871. It seems to me, in my memory, it's more like 1880s, early 1880s. But that facility, I've been there several times. That facility is still there. You can just see the old 1880s, structure. And then the same thing with what we call Fort Omaha, which is now part of the Metropolitan Community College campus. But it's got the General Dodge House there. It's an 1880s era, military facility, or it was back then, that was supplying the troops and installations and things to the west of that. So this, where I'm located, was sort of a key center for the administration of all that particular territory. I was always curious as to why Sheridan was located in Chicago, but I guess that was the more advanced, larger population city from which to exercise his command and things like that. So he decides, all right, we're going to do this buffalo hunt. Any idea why they chose where they did? I mean, this would have, they went out to basically a little tiny plot of ground alongside a railroad track at the junction of the North and South Platte rivers, called North Platte. Any idea why they selected that particular location?
I think it was just because that was an area that was known to have good buffalo hunting. So,
Okay.
and yeah, it's in the southwest corner of Nebraska. And it is pretty far away from most other things,
Yeah.
as you know, so.
Well, the Army installation that was there was Fort McPherson, which had been established as a outpost to basically protect the migrants along the Oregon Trail, because they were still being, they were crossing disputed Indian territory, even though I think it was the Treaty of 1854 or something like that, the Indians had ceded them the right of way to go through there. There were quite a few Indians who didn't agree with that policy. So they set up that fort there, and of course that then became the center where they had various cavalry troops. At one point, just before they got there, there was an all-black regiment, cavalry regiment, and then from there it shifted over to, and it was transferred over to they assigned the 2nd U.S. Cavalry to go there. So Sheridan obviously then would have contacted, I assume, by telegraph, because that's probably how all this is going on.
Yeah.
So where is Alexis in this? What kind of preparations do you think he's having to make to get ready to do this?
None.
Okay.
I mean, I think everything, all of the arrangements were made completely separate from him and his party, because while all these preparations were being made, they were traveling through these cities on the way to the West. So, with the exception of, communication to just sort of, fine tune the dates, I don't think that Alexis and his party were involved at all in any of the planning or the arrangements at all. There's a lot of telegram traffic about the preparations for the buffalo hunt through these various military routes, about transportation of people and goods, food, and the necessary equipment and all that sort of thing. But that's all being taken care of behind the scenes, and Alexis isn't a party to it.
So I'm curious, how did you collect? I mean, in what little research I did, I basically went on the Library of Congress website and I found old newspapers, right, that were reported on. How did you go about collecting and getting access to these different resources?
So I did what you did. I looked at the newspapers from every city Alexis visited, every city along his route. And sometimes that meant traveling to those locations, because those are not all digitized. So a lot of times I had to go and use microfilm in those locations. I also looked at public libraries and historical societies in all of those cities. And I'll tell you, I would contact them in advance and let them know what I was looking for. And then I would go in person, and always I would find something in person that they had not found themselves, simply because I couldn't give them a laundry list of every single possible thing to search. I have no doubt that they did their best, but when I would get there in person, of course, I had all of these things like, other key terms I could look for, right? And so I would find more things. I also discovered that there are people out there, especially regarding the buffalo hunt, who are private collectors of items related to Buffalo Bill and Custer and the Old West. And so there are people who own those stereograph photos. There are people who have collected telegrams and things like that. And so when I discovered these people through various means, sometimes because they outbid me on eBay, I would then contact them personally, and let them know that I was writing a book. And there was one gentleman in particular who had outbid me on a couple of items. And when I finally did track him down, he had this enormous collection, which he was happy to share with me. And he scanned everything he owned.
Wow.
And shared it with me. So that was incredibly generous of him. There also was a small group of 3 archaeologists, scientists who were working on doing some surface level excavations of the campsite
Right.
where the buffalo hunt took place. And
Doug
they were
Scott
very,
and Peter Bled, or Bleed. And those
yes,
guys,
and
yeah.
they were very generous in sharing any research they had done, any documents they had managed to get that I had not found also. So
Right.
it was fortuitous that I met them at the site, actually, because then, I could share information with them and they could share it with me. And, as academics in different fields, we weren't competing with one another. So it's
Right.
not like we had to worry about the other
Right.
person beating us to the punch and getting their book published and stealing our thunder. And so we
Right.
were able to share.
So did you actually get to the site, or
I did. And one of the things that, that I would like to mention is that, for 10 years in this tiny little city of Hayes Center, Nebraska,
right?
they commemorated this buffalo hunt, and they would have people come dressed in costume, pretending to be those
Right,
characters like
reenactors, yeah.
Alexis. Yes, historical reenactors. Other people would come, so these kinds of mountain men groups would come and camp out, and they would dress in period costumes and stay out overnight and cook and everything. And
Right.
it was a 2-day event, which was quite delightful, and I was fortunate enough to attend, I think, 3 times. And in doing so, I was able to go out to the site of the excavation, and to the historical markers that I think you mentioned to me last time.
Right.
And that was just amazing. It was amazing to be around a group of people who were that interested, not only just in Grand Duke Alexis and that particular event, but just that those physical remainders, those physical manifestations of history. So, they were thrilled about things like buttons and, shards of glass and the
Right.
foil that was on top of the champagne bottles that were popped when Alexis shot a buffalo, and it was fun to be around a whole group of people who were so excited about that history surrounding that event and that period of time.
Right. Well, as I mentioned last time, I had a chance to go to the site. The Mintling family granted me access and pointed us in the direction. We had to drive through one of his fields, which had just been planted. I don't know whether it was wheat or corn or what it was. It was just about that high. Excuse me. And to go there and then wander across that rickety bridge. We had the guy with the drone had a little wagon with him, and we had to get that. So that was fun. And to see that and to try to figure out, I've seen some reproductions of those stereographs, and we might explain that basically there was a photographer there, although I don't know if we know exactly who that was taking them, whether they were assigned there by the, what was it, the New York Post or who did the.
Yeah, it was not the New York Post. I'm drawing a blank now, but a New York newspaper sent a reporter and a photographer. Right. And I'll say that, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but I think that is probably the most accurate account of the buffalo hunt, because there are lots of tall tales that have been told about the buffalo hunt since then. But I think the newspaper account is probably the most accurate.
Yeah, well, they had somebody there. The thing that amazes me, though, is those were daily dispatches.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm still trying to figure out, there wasn't a telegraph, on my knowledge, there was no telegraph line there. So they had to ride basically 70 miles to either Fort McPherson, which isn't there anymore. It's just a monument, except for which is the military cemetery that is around about half a mile away. But the fort itself is just a marker there. It's private property. Either that, or they had to go into North Platte, and I assumed the train depot and where the telegraph might have been. And apparently they did this, somebody rode that distance every day for 3 days. And I drove it, and it's a long drive at 70 miles an hour in a comfortable SUV.
Mm-hmm.
So riding, it had to be, a 6-8 hour, horseback ride, up across those hills and ravines and things. through what was still, I mean, it hadn't been really sort of homesteaded quite yet. That would come about a decade later. That's when the Mentlings established their homestead. I think the marker there says something like 1884 or 1885 or something like that. So this was still pretty rugged, wild country, and somebody, a dispatch rider, cavalry, whoever they assigned to that, to take those messages up there. So people back east were able to have, almost, it's like we would have today, how excited we were when we finally had satellite television, right? You could shoot a story in Europe and see it on American television, a few hours later. Well, this was a day later,
Well, I
within
think,
print.
and I think this is testimony to, it's this story of Grand Duke Alexis, with the exception, as I said, of the Buffalo part, it's largely unknown. And that's really quite amazing, because at the time it was literally front page news.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, that would have taken substantial effort to make sure that story got reported every day during that buffalo hunt, and yet they did it, and people were clamoring for that news. There were, and at the various events in the big cities, the balls, the banquets, so on, Alexis's movements were closely watched, and people were identified by name, and described at these balls and events. And sometimes it would be an entire front page of a newspaper.
Yeah.
And then there might be several small articles later in the newspaper. I mean, this was the top news of the day.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of remarkable that, it's been forgotten. And it's particularly since it's such a fascinating story.
All right. And involves such interesting characters. So let's touch on those interesting characters. So Phil Sheridan, or Little Phil as he was known, was of Irish extraction, made his name during the Civil War as a famous, American Civil War general, is put in charge then, as I said, I think they call it the Department of the Missouri. And he has to set this thing up. So he's sending these telegrams you mentioned back and forth. He's ordering, I assume, supplies out of Omaha, the depot, to make their way, probably by train to Fort McPherson. And then the cavalry there is to, send out a party to select a campsite and then, equip it with the tents and all those things that appear on those stereographs. And I would love to be able, I tried to get some local access here, because all I have are the reproductions out of Doug Scott and Peter Bled's, out of their book. And so and what I wanted to do is when I went there, I wanted to try to line them up, right? To try to see where, where the tents might have been located. I think I sort of figured it out, but it would have been, if I'd had access to the real thing, it would have been fun. So he has to, and one of the interesting people that he invites on this hunt is an old friend of his, a dashing cavalry officer by the name of
Buffalo Bill?
No, not
Oh, Custer.
Yes, George Armstrong Custer.
Yeah.
Which is what really grabbed my attention. What? So here is Sheridan. He's setting this up, and he says, "Hey, George, you want to take part in a buffalo hunt?" And of course, Custer was actually familiar with the area because he had been stationed there in the mid to late 1860s, and it actually, from what I understand, actually had traveled that route, because it was actually a route from Fort McPherson down to Fort Hays, I think. So it was somewhat of a known route, and there was an Army wagon train route or something near through there. So it was kind of a known area to them. But you're right, it was still at that time still fairly rich in buffalo. So he invites George Armstrong Custer, who I gather was not at this point assigned to look after the 7th Cavalry. That would come later. So what kind of do you know of that?
That the Custer's history I'm not as familiar with. I mean, I read enough of it to write the book, but I'm not an expert on Custer in the least. So And
So
there's
well,
so
at this
much
point,
written
at
on
least,
him.
from what I understand, he was not assigned to command of the 7th Cavalry, of which he then later goes on to ill fame
Yeah.
up at the Little Bighorn. Which interesting, Doug Scott, who was the co-author of the book you mentioned earlier, is one of the was the National Park Service's archaeology expert on the Battle of the Little Bighorn, I think, if I remember correctly. And I'm pleased to say that Doug is acting as a volunteer consultant to
Oh, good.
our project, as is Peter. So and why can't I think of the third author's name? It's just,
I don't know. I can't either right
yeah,
now.
it's on the bookshelf behind me, but I don't want to go hunt for it. Okay, so we're at this point in the journey. He goes to Chicago.
Mhm. And before we move on to the buffalo hunt, I want to say a couple of words about Chicago. So just to
Okay, yes,
remind
please.
people that when he's in Chicago for New Year's, this is only, about 11 weeks after the Great Fire.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Chicago had just been devastated by the Great Fire, and it's sort of remarkable that they managed to pull this visit off. But
Yeah.
city officials wanted to invite Grand Duke Alexis. This, of course, as I said, was the big deal. Everybody was doing it, and they didn't want to be left out. And they had this sentiment that they wanted to demonstrate that Chicago would rebuild. Chicago would be great again. And so they decided that it was important for them to do this. And so they did invite Alexis, and he accepted, and he was given a tour of the burn districts. And of course, his visit there was a little more modest. There was, less pageantry than in other cities, but they managed to pull it off. And I think it's interesting because in one of his speeches, Alexis makes a comment and says something about Moscow rebuilding after a great fire in the early 19th century, and sort of giving them some sense of
You can do this.
hope that they would be able to revive themselves as well. And I think I mentioned this in a talk I gave recently. It sort of reminds me of the attitude in New Orleans after Katrina. A lot of people thought, like, just let that city go, right? It's devastated by floods and stuff too much. But it was so important to the people there to come back from that, and to demonstrate to the rest of the country that they could bounce back and be the great city they were before. And Chicago had that same sense after the fire. And Alexis was a part of that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Chicago also is, becomes the great meat packing center. And there's another individual whose life is really interesting. That's Thomas Lipton.
Oh.
And you're familiar with Lipton tea? Okay, well, tea was only part of his business. He was actually a grocer. And what he did was he started off in Glasgow with a little grocery store, importing pork from Ireland, which is his parents' home thing. And he builds this thing into a giant world conglomerate. And one of his major packing plants was in Chicago.
Oh.
Right around this period. I don't know if it was during he was there at the fire or shortly afterwards, but it became important for that as well. He also, for a short period of time, had another packing plant here in Omaha, but he only held it for a few months, and then he sold it to somebody else. So,
well, I didn't run across his name, but it's interesting because Alexis did tour a pork packing plant in Chicago.
And it could have been Lipton's.
So I didn't run across that name, but interesting.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've got him in Chicago. He's given the tour. I'm assuming his next stop is obviously going to be St. Louis.
He did go to St. Louis as well.
Right. So is there anything happen important in St. Louis? Because at that point, then he boards a train, Destin, Kansas City, and then of course into Omaha.
Well, I mean, there are lots of things that are important to people in St. Louis, right? But so he he does the same kinds of things he does in other cities, that banquets and balls, and he visits a relatively new bridge in St. Louis. And that's, again, I think I mentioned last time that one of the interesting things is that although a lot of his visit was about parties and, theater performances, he did visit industrial sites. He visited engineering sites. He visited a few prisons. So he was actually, by his request, gathering
A lot of
information.
intelligence.
Yeah, well, or that may not be the way to put it.
Right.
I don't know that there was any nefarious intent, but he was gathering information to take home, and in various places he did ask for copies of blueprints, or he asked for information that he could take back home to his country. So I think that's very interesting too, because a lot of the visit is about all of these fancy dinners and fancy dresses and balls, but there was some serious there was a serious intellectual element to it as well.
Right. So from there, then I think, if I'm not mistaken, isn't that where he sees the riverboat? I think that will eventually take him down to New Orleans.
Yes, I think you're correct. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Another one, a little trivia thing. All right. So from there, then his next basic destination is going to be Omaha.
Mm-hmm.
I have ridden years and years ago. There used to be passenger train service between Kansas City and Omaha that came up that side of the Missouri River. And I had, as a kid, the opportunity to go down and visit my grandmother, who lived on one of the communities along the track. And literally within just a few, half a mile of where that train came through. So he comes into Omaha, but he does not stop here. From what I gather, this is where he then meets with George Armstrong Custer at the Union Pacific Station, which, by the way, is still on the station that's there now, which is now called the Durham History Museum. It's been converted over to a museum. That Union Pacific Railroad station sits on the site of the original station, which was torn down and rebuilt in the 1920s-ish. It's kind of has a Art Deco like look to it, but it's basically, many respects, it resembles, even the way they updated it, like taking an old Volkswagen Beetle and making a new Beetle out of it. They sort of took many of the same elements that were in the original station and made it this train station, the front portico and the things like that. So he meets up with George Armstrong Custer, and then they ride overnight to North Platte, Nebraska. What was that journey like, do you think?
Well, so one of the things that we mentioned last time is, Alexis could speak English very well.
Yeah.
So I think that, that gives us probably the likelihood that he could participate in conversation, and he could, he could talk with other people, right? Alexis had expressed excitement about the visit. He was a man who had traveled a lot himself. He had traveled with the Navy, so he was a frequent traveler. He was used to traveling. He was a good hunter. He had been on hunts, of course, in Russia. So I imagine it was a really jovial and excited atmosphere as they made their way out west.
Champagne or wine or hard liquor?
I would guess champagne, but I don't know. So along the various routes of his visit, there were descriptions of drinking and just sort of sitting around and talking and being friendly, but there's no talk of any kind of hard alcohol. Maybe that was just left out of the descriptions. I don't know. But yeah, I imagine it was an exciting trip out west. And by this point, Alexis would have been traveling for quite a while. So his English would be even better at this point than it would have been when he arrived. So.
Did this trip was, what role did Union Pacific play in this? I don't think that the train or the cars or anything, those had been separately arranged for them and they were just basically using the track?
Yes, so there actually was a a special arrangement for all of Grand Duke's trip. There were special train cars set aside. And also one of the most fascinating things, by the way, for someone who's interested in history and trains, I mean, they would print these special train cards that would let everybody know when Alexis's train was coming through.
Okay.
And all, of course, all the other trains were told to give Alexis's train the right of way, right? But there are these time cards that say the Grand Duke Alexis is going to be coming through, and these again are things that people have collected, and so you can sometimes find them for sale on eBay.
Wow.
Or they exist in historical societies, and some of them are amazingly beautiful and ornate. So all along the way, the railroad cooperated with the plans for the Grand Duke's travels and all the different railroad lines. Obviously, they weren't all the same in the US. There were lots of different ones, but all those railroad lines cooperated to make sure that the Grand Duke's train had the right of way and that everybody knew when he was coming through. And of course, this information also drew people to the rail lines to wave and hope to get a glimpse of Alexis.
Right. Wow. So he rides the rails. He ends up, I don't know, do we want to go into the hunt at this point, or do we want to leave as a cliffhanger?
We should probably save that because we're already 40 minutes in at this point. So we should probably save that for next time.
Yeah, let's save that. So we've got this great train ride. We got a buffalo hunt that is itself historic in so many different ways. And we will pick up the story after Christmas.
Yes.
How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Good. Thank you so much, Lee. I really appreciate your doing this. This is fun. I like talking about this, particularly with somebody who knows what they're talking about.
And it's such a great story. And as I said, I think for anyone who loves history and appreciates history, there are a million different ways in which this story can be appreciated, whether you're a fan of the Old West or you're a fan of just this time period. If you are interested in material culture of the period, and the tangible remains of history. I mean, this story has so many wonderful aspects to it.
Well, let's make sure that we talk next time then about your personal collection. So I gather you were able to collect a few things?
Well, yes. And I got this one out in preparation, but we can talk about it next time. So this is a handkerchief.
Wow.
That was owned by, that was a gift from Alexis to one of the Russians traveling with him. And I recently was able to purchase it. So it's very exciting. And this is the kind of thing that, history geeks like us get very excited about, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Very cool. All right, Lee, thank you so much. You have a good Christmas, and let's plan to talk, hopefully, if you can work in your schedule, maybe between now and New Year's.
I might not be able to do that. It might have to be afterwards because I'm visiting my family. But I'll be in touch.
Whenever it works out for you.
Okay, great.
Sounds great. Thank you.